Mistborn's magic systems are some of the most impressive and meticulously well-crafted in fiction, and today we are going to be going in-depth to explain not only how these magic systems work, but also how they interact with each other. Since I will be explaining the entirety of how these magics work, it will involve some spoilers from both Mistborn Era 1 and 2, so you have been warned. Without further ado, let us begin our journey to the planet Scadrial. Now, before we get into the weeds of all the individual powers, it's important to explain the two types of magic systems in fantasy stories. Soft magic is characterized by its lack of rules that revel in being unexplainable. Think Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. On the other hand, the Mistborn series has what's known as a hard magic system. Hard magic is distinguished by its strict adherence to clearly defined rules and limitations. As you will soon see, Mistborn's author Brandon Sanderson crafted one of the premier showcases of this style of magic. So enough with the background. The three types of magic in the Mistborn series are Allomancy, Feruchemy, and Hemalurgy. We will start by going one by one through each overall magic system as well as the individual powers gained through the various metals they interact with. First up, Allomancy. Allomancy is the first magic system we will go over and most certainly the one you know if you have ever heard of the Mistborn series. Users of Allomancy are called Allomancers, and they have the ability to burn metals within them once ingested to activate powers corresponding to whichever metal was used. Allomancers can also flare these metals by burning through them at a faster rate, giving them a more powerful version of that ability, but for a shorter time. The vast majority of Allomancers are what's known as mistings, meaning they can only burn one type of metal and use only one ability. Mistborns, on the other hand, are able to use all of the available metals and powers, giving them an immense amount of versatility. These metals are split into four categories being physical, mental, enhancement, and temporal. These are found in pairs, with the powers being complementary effects. You can further divide these metals into internal and external powers and pushing and pulling powers, with each metal fitting into one category each. As I said earlier, hard magic like this has a ton of rules, and it's okay if you're a little confused or lost so far. As we get into the 16 basic metals, we will break down the categories they fit in, their pairings, and their abilities. I'll also tell you the special nickname that a misting is given corresponding to their power. Ready? Let's start with the physical metals. For our first pairing, we have steel and iron. Steel users known as coin shots can push metal, most often coins, like projectiles at high speeds. They also can push against metal to soar through the air by maintaining momentum with metal underneath them, usually by throwing coins between them and the ground. Iron mistings, known as lurchers, are able to pull metal toward them. Both the pushing and pulling are proportional to their physical mass, meaning larger Allomancers can push or pull more powerfully than someone smaller than them. Metal that is embedded inside another person cannot normally be affected by either ability. Steel is an external pushing metal, while iron is an external pulling metal. The next pairing up is pewter and tin. Pewter users, known as thugs, are able to increase their physical abilities such as strength, speed, durability, balance, and rate of healing. Thugs can also burn pewter naturally, even when unconscious, in order to heal from life-threatening injuries. There's also a method of burning pewter known as pewter dragging, in which users constantly burn pewter, enabling them to run for extended distances very fast. This is extraordinarily dangerous as you will collapse in extreme weakness afterwards, and many pewter users have died easily as a result. Tin users, known as tin eyes, are able to increase sensitivity in all five senses. This ability can be extremely useful, but extended use tends to make the user extremely uncomfortable, with normal situations like walking on rocks or staring at a fireplace becoming unbearable. We will cover this more later in the section on savantism. Pewter is an internal pushing metal, while tin is an internal pulling metal. Moving on from the flashy physical metals, let's take a look at the much more subtle mental metals. First up for the mental metals, we have zinc and brass. Zinc users, known as riders, have the ability to inflame another person's emotions. On the other hand, brass users, known as soothers, have the ability to dampen people's emotions. Both of these abilities must not be mistaken for mind control, though, as if someone's feeling a very strong emotion one way and the rider or soother is trying to make them feel the opposite, it can be very tough for them to be influenced into that intended emotion. It's also important to mention that both of these abilities can be used on groups of people as well as individuals. Zinc is an external pulling metal, while brass is an external pushing metal. Next up, we have copper and bronze. Copper users, known as smokers, have the ability to hide allomantic pulses from other people in a radius around them. Allomantic pulses are a normally invisible signal that appears when using allomantic abilities. Bronze users, known as seekers, have the ability to hear those same allomantic pulses. These two metals basically play a sort of cat and mouse game with each other, and while they may seem basic, they are indispensable for any group of Allomancers. Copper is an internal pulling metal, while bronze is an internal pushing metal. Now, onto the enhancement metals. First up, we have the pairing of duralumin and aluminum. Durillamin users, known as Durillamin Gnats, have the ability to enhance any other metals burned. Aluminum users, known as Aluminum Gnats, have the ability to wipe their internal allomantic metal reserve. Now you may be wondering, didn't you mention that Allomancers either have access to one or all abilities? How are the powers of any use at all if you're a Durillamin or Aluminum misting? Now, you would be a very smart person for asking this question, and the answer is that yes, being a Durillamin or Aluminum misting is basically completely useless. You can technically burn the metal in your system, but it will do absolutely nothing for you on its own. To make actual use of these metals in Allomancy, you will either have to be a Mistborn or mess with Hemalurgy shenanigans, which we'll talk about later. Now, if you are a Mistborn, congratulations! Your already overpowered moveset has gotten a humongous boost. With Durillamin, you can supercharge all your other powers with a massive burst of energy. Aluminum, on the other hand, is just kinda useless. Sorry. Durillamin is an internal pushing metal, while aluminum is an internal pulling metal. Moving on from those, brilliant metals, we have Nitrocell and Chromium. Nitrocell users, known as Nitrobursts, have the ability to enhance the allomantic ability of metals being burned by the Nitroburst target by touching them. This does have the side effect of draining that person's allomantic reserves quickly in exchange for that power-up, so it can be used to help allies or trip up opponents. Chromium users, known as Leechers, are able to make the allomantic reserves of another Allomancer disappear instantly by touching him. So basically aluminum, but actually good. Nitrocell is an external pushing metal, while Chromium is an external pulling metal. It's now time for us to move on to our final allomantic group, the temporal metals. And get ready, because these are some of the craziest ones yet. Our first temporal pairing is Gold and Electrum. Gold users, known as Augurs, can see a vision of who the user could have been in the past had they made different choices, known as a Gold Shadow. Each time an Allomancer burns gold, the vision changes based on their current circumstances. Electrum users, known as Oracles, are able to reveal possible features of the user up to a couple of seconds. Gold is an internal pulling metal, while Electrum is an internal pushing metal. For our last basic metal pairing, we have Cadmium and Bendalloy. Cadmium users, known as Pulsars, have the ability to create a time bubble around them that slows down time, essentially making time move faster outside of it. Bendalloy users, known as Sliders, have the exact opposite ability. They create a time bubble that speeds up time inside of the bubble, while time moves slower outside of it. Both of these bubbles stay stationary, with the Allomancer having the ability to pop the bubble on demand, or by walking through it. Cadmium is an external pulling metal, while Bendalloy is an external pushing metal. As you can see, these powers range from completely useless to insanely overpowered, and super simple to very complicated. But now, it's time for me to admit something. You might have noticed I've been referring to these metals as the 16 basic metals, and that's because there are a few ultra-rare metals that exist outside of this framework. These are the God metals. So before we get into the individual God metals, I should probably explain what they are exactly. This will involve me getting into some broader Cosmere lore, so just bear with me. So, in Brandon Sanderson's shared universe, the Cosmere, many planets exist with different magics and cultures. An inciting event in the creation of these magics is what's known as the Shattering. Ad nauseam, the equivalent of God in the Cosmere, was shattered into 16 shards. Each of these 16 powers were taken up by the individuals who shattered Ad nauseam. The two shards relevant to the Mistborn magic system are Preservation and Ruin. These two godlike beings created the world Mistborn takes place on, Scadrial. Born out of these two figures are two distinct god metals. God metals created by other shards across the Cosmere are also theoretically allomantically viable, but their uses are, as of right now, unknown. But as for the metals we do know, first up we have Adium. Adium users known as Seers draw on the power of Ruin and let the user see into the future by a few seconds using Adium shadows that perform future actions. Think of this like a souped-up version of Electrum. This ability is extremely powerful and near impossible to counter in a fight. As this is a god metal, this and the other god metals we'll talk about today do not fit in the categories of the 16 basic metals discussed earlier. They're really kind of just off on their own island of insane power. Adium can also theoretically be alloyed with all 16 basic metals, but only one is known, which we'll discuss in a bit. Next up is Lerasium. Lerasium is a very interesting metal, as it's effectively only useful one time ever per person. This metal is able to be burned by anyone, not just Mistings or Mistborns, and will turn them into a fully fledged Mistborn once used. If a Mistborn or Misting that already have powers were to burn this metal, it would substantially increase their already existing powers. Burning Lerasium in combination with Durillamin does not have any effect. Unfortunately, due to its interesting qualities, there's no fun name for lerasium users, as it's not really possible to be a lerasium misting. Last up, we have Maladium. Maladium is interesting, as it's an alloy of adium and gold, and acts similarly to gold. Instead of being able to see your own potential future, Maladium gives the user the ability to see into another person's past or potential alternate past had this person made alternate choices. There's no known record of Maladium mistings existing, and Maladium also becomes seemingly unknown by the time of Era 2. In my opinion, Maladium is kind of the black sheep of the known allomantic metals, as it's really only relevant for one plotline in the first book. There we have it, all of the metals and their allomantic properties covered. Before we move on to the next magic system, I want to address the risky process that occurs when you flare your metals for long periods of time: savantism. After extensive uses of any metal, an allomancer's body will begin adapting to it, causing a change in their abilities. While an allomancer's power is usually increased when they become a savant, this process is extremely damaging to the body. For example, in Mistborn Era 1, we see that a tin savant is forced to wear a blindfold and stuff wool in his ears while out during the day to protect from the now blinding light and screeching sounds he perceives. Since becoming a savant requires an extreme amount of metal and can lead to these side effects, it's very rare to see savants. Alright, time for our second magic system, Feruchemy. Users of Feruchemy are known as feruchemists. Feruchemists have the ability to store attributes inside of metal that they are making physical contact with. Feruchemists are categorized similarly to allomancers as well. Fairings are the feruchemist equivalent to mistings that can fill and tap only one single metal, while full feruchemists are the equivalent of Mistborns and have the ability to fill and tap all metals. When a feruchemist taps into these metals at the same rate that they stored it, they will gain this attribute for the exact amount of time they previously put in. On the other hand, if the feruchemist decides to tap into the attribute at a faster rate, they will burn through the stored attribute far more quickly, similarly to flaring in Allomancy. A piece of metal that has been used by a feruchemist to store attributes is known as a metal mind. These metal minds can be either sealed, meaning only usable by the feruchemist who filled it, unkeyed, meaning anyone with the proper feruchemical ability can access it, and unsealed, meaning that they can be used by anyone, even those without natural feruchemical abilities. Unsealed metal mines are very rare, and as of Era 2, they're really only used in Southern Scadrial. Feruchemists are capable of innately knowing how much of an attribute is stored in any given metal mine like a reflex. In Feruchemy, the 16 basic metals are a little easier to grasp than they are in Allomancy. All 16 basic metals are divided into 4 categories of 4 metals each, being physical, cognitive, spiritual, and hybrid. Also, don't worry, there are special nicknames for all of the fairing types as well. Now, without further ado, it's time for us to roll through the 16 metals yet again and see what power awaits us when they are utilized in Feruchemy. Iron. Iron fairings, known as skimmers, have the ability to store or gain physical mass. It's important to note that this does not affect gravity around the feruchemist, just the actual mass. When tapping at opportune moments in a fight, like right before a punch, they can add weight to an attack, causing devastating damage to whoever they're fighting. While tapping weight does increase the mass of a person, it doesn't make the skimmer's skin any tougher, and they can be hurt just like a normal person can by bullets or knives or any weapons like that. When storing mass, a skimmer will be able to fall from higher distances, making this one of the few feruchemical abilities that actually has use when both storing or tapping. Steel. Steel fairings, known as steel runners, are able to, you guessed it, store or gain physical speed. When tapping their metal mines, steel runners can move at insane speeds as well as burn metals faster. Steel fairings do not have any special protections that you might see with other super speed characters in fiction like the Flash, and do have to worry about wind resistance. When storing speed, steel runners move very slowly, almost as if they are walking through thick sand or mud. Tin. Tin fairings, known as wind whisperers, are able to store or gain the sensitivity of their senses. It is of note that a different metal mine must be used for each different sense. When tapping senses, the wind whisperer gains increased potency in whatever sense they enhance. For example, when tapping their sense of smell, they could taste deeper and richer flavors. When storing their senses become dulled. For example, when storing sight, a feruchemist must wear glasses in order to see normally. Pewter. Pewter fairings, known as brutes, are able to store or gain physical strength. It's important to note that when tapping pewter, the fairings literally gain an immense amount of muscle mass proportional to how much they tap. Basically, what I'm saying is that brutes are essentially just the equivalent of the Hulk in the Cosmere, except they keep their intelligence. When storing strength, brutes lose muscle mass, becoming physically weak and scrawny. That's it for the physical metals. Now let's brain blast our way through to the cognitive metals. Zinc. Zinc fairings, known as sparkers, are able to store or gain mental speed. When tapping zinc, the sparker is able to think far faster than usual, helping them solve complex problems with ease. When storing mental speed, the sparker will experience a delay in their cognitive function and reasoning, making it difficult to take in complicated information. This effect is extremely similar to what happens to me when I'm trying to research and understand anything and everything relating to Sanderson's magic systems. Brass. Brass fairings, known as fire souls, are able to store or gain warmth. Brass is another metal that is very useful when tapping or storing. Tapping brass in cold climates is extremely useful, as the fire souls will be able to withstand low temperature without much protection. Likewise, storing heat can be useful in extremely hot climates as well. Copper. Copper fairings, known as archivists, are able to store or gain memories. When storing memories, the specific stored memory is erased from the individual archivist's mind. It is, however, possible to only half store the memory, which will allow it to be kind of fuzzily remembered by the archivist, with the downside that the memory in the copper mind itself will also be degraded. Bronze. Bronze fairings, known as sentries, are able to gain or store wakefulness. This allows the sentry to stay awake for long periods of time with a high level of awareness. When storing wakefulness, the sentry will feel a level of drowsiness proportional to how much he's storing at one time. Now, let's get into the deepest regions of this magic system with the mysterious spiritual metals. Chromium. Chromium fairings, known as spinners, have the ability to store or gain fortune. Fortune itself is extremely mysterious, with no one knowing exactly how it works. Sanderson has played coy when asked about Fortune's effects, and has said that we will have to wait and see all about Fortune in future Cosmere books. For now, the consensus among most is that when tapping chromium, you become more lucky, and when storing chromium, you become unlucky. Nicrosil. Nicrosil fairings, known as soul bearers, have the ability to store or gain investiture. Now, investiture is something in the Cosmere that could have its whole long dedicated video on its own, but the long and short of it is that investiture is basically the spiritual energy of the Cosmere that powers all of the magic systems across the universe, including the ones on Scadrial. When soul bearers store their own investiture into a metal mind, it basically stores their ability to utilize a specific magic system. For instance, a soul bearer could store the very ability to use Feruchemy itself in one of these metal mines, in order for someone else later to temporarily use this power when tapping an unsealed Nicrosil metal mine. This power can also theoretically allow the user to store any magic system from any of Sanderson's various series for temporary use later, if the soul bearer has access to it. If you are only a soul bearer and not a full Feruchemist, your ability is effectively useless to yourself when tapping into a sealed metal mine, as you are only storing or gaining access to a power you already have. Nicrosil on its own is used in the making of the unsealed metal mines I mentioned earlier, seen in Era 2, that can give these feruchemical abilities to anyone that accesses it. The exact nature of how these medallions are exactly created are still shrouded in mystery, though. Aluminum. Aluminum fairings, known as true selves, have the ability to store or strengthen the spiritual sense of identity. Identity in the Cosmere is basically the spiritual version of an ID that tells you who is who. All we really know beyond this is that a full Feruchemist could theoretically store all of their identity, giving them the ability to use any metal mind, even sealed ones. Beyond that, aluminum Feruchemy is still extremely mysterious, alongside all of the spiritual metals we've talked about so far, and we really don't have much info on it. Luckily, our last spiritual metal does have information and is more clear-cut. Duralumin. Duralumin fairings, known as connectors, have the ability to store or strengthen spiritual connection. Connection in the Cosmere is basically the spiritual connection between someone and the people, places, or items they interact with. For instance, in Allomancy, when burning Lerasium, your soul makes a connection with the Shard Preservation in order to give you the full Mistborn powers. Tapping a Duralumin metal mind will strengthen the connection between the Feruchemist and their target at a faster than normal rate. On the flip side, filling a Duralumin metal mind will reduce other people's connection with the connector, causing them to become more distant or less friendly. A fun use for Duralumin, as seen in Era 2, is where unsealed metal mind medallions powered by Duralumin allow the user to communicate flawlessly with people who speak other languages. Hopefully that explanation of all the spiritual metals was easy enough to follow around, because they are by far the aspects of this magic system we know the least about. Luckily, the next section is way more straightforward and can really just be seen as the second physical metal category. Last, but certainly not least, the hybrid metals. Cadmium. Cadmium fairings, known as gaspers, have the ability to store or tap breathing. Tapping breathing lets the fairing go without breathing for extended amounts of time. When storing breathing, the user must breathe in and out, essentially hyperventilating at a much higher rate to keep from passing out. While the ability to store breath is very good, it's pretty evident that it'd be extremely difficult to build up a large quantity of stored breaths, as you would have to be doing this for a long period of time. And no, Sanderson fans, these breaths have nothing to do with the ones we see in Warbreaker. Bendalloy. Bendalloy Fairings, known as subsumers, have the ability to store or gain nutrition/hydration. Tapping a metal mine allows a user to go without food for as long as the metal mine stays full. Filling a Bendalloy metal mine will cause you to be able to eat as much food as you want without getting full. This feruchemical power hasn't been seen in the novels beyond what we know in the Ars Arcanum at the back of the book, but I gotta say this is one of the best deals power-wise. Literally being able to eat anything you want, not gaining any weight, and then releasing the calories at will. Is this hinting at competitive eater fairings in Era 3? Only Sanderson knows. Gold. Finally, we are back to an ability that we see prominently in the books. Gold fairings, known as Bloodmakers, have the ability to store health. When tapping gold metal mines, the Bloodmaker can heal from wounds and diseases, even ones that to a normal person would be fatal. It cannot, however, cure aging or genetic conditions, as those are considered core to your spiritual identity. Remember when we mentioned identity in the aluminum section? It's relevant here too. When storing health, the Bloodmaker spends time sickly. This makes filling up the gold metal mine particularly difficult. Electrum. And at long last, we've reached the final of the 16 basic feruchemical metals. Feels like just yesterday we finished talking about Allomancy. Anyway, Electrum fairings, known as Pinnacles, have the ability to store or strengthen their determination. This is unfortunately another metal that we don't know that much about yet. From what we can gather, Electrum sends the user into a manic state of extreme focus, while storing determination will seemingly make the user depressed. God metals. Like Allomancy, Feruchemy does indeed have access to the God metals. Unlike Allomancy, where we had several long explanations of the various metal powers and abilities, so far we have only seen one god metal be used in Feruchemy, that being Adium, and thankfully its power is super simple. Adium. Adium fairings, known as... Wait, I'm looking here at my notes. There's no canon name for Adium fairings. Guess we gotta give them a super cool name ourselves. How about Youth Seeker? Yeah, that sounds cool, let's go with that. Youth Seekers have the ability to store or gain youth. When tapping an Adium metal mine, the user stays physically young, while storing youth causes them to age. Now, since this seemingly stores age, could a youth seeker technically age themselves down to a baby? Is this how Apple TV gets their Mistborn Babies animated spin-off, featuring family-friendly hijinks for the ages 2 to 6 demographic? Alright, I need to calm down. Now that we have finished discussing the metals, it's probably important for me to explain the concept of twinborns before I lose any more of my brain cells and begin pitching more brilliant ideas for spin-offs. After the events of Era 1, Twinborn began appearing once the Terrace people with their feruchemical abilities mate with non-Terrace people with allomantic abilities. This causes their children to potentially be born with both a random metal feruchemical ability and a random metal allomantic ability, though it's not guaranteed, of course. Now, on its own, while this can make for a powerful combination, it's still just a pairing of abilities we've already talked about. Although, there is one big wrinkle. This brings us to the pinnacle of Feruchemy, compounding. If you are a twinborn with the same metal for both your allomantic and feruchemical ability, your power set gets a massive boost. What compounding effectively does is use your allomantic ability to power your feruchemical one. When compounding, you do not get the effect of the allomantic ability, however. One of the most notable examples of compounding is seen with a gold twinborn who can effectively infinitely heal himself even when being shot at point-blank range. Another very important use we see for compounding throughout the series is adium compounding. By compounding adium, an individual can stay young indefinitely. By accessing both adium and gold compounding, you become fully immortal and impossible to kill via any normal means. Scary stuff. And you know what else is scary? Our last Mistborn magic system. The darkest one in all of the Cosmere. Here it is, folks. Hemalurgy. Hemalurgy is a gruesome process in which someone can transfer allomancy, feruchemy, or innate human strength into them. In order to gain these abilities, someone must insert a spike made of one of the metals into a specific bind point that are in contact with moving blood throughout the human body. This hemalurgist can then insert that now charged spike from the donor into their own body, gaining those abilities. This process results in almost certain death for the donor and causes stress to the spirit of the hemalurgist. Only one attribute can be stolen per person to charge up a hemalurgic spike. Hemalurgy is the only way to gain multiple allomantic or feruchemical abilities without being a Mistborn or full feruchemist, which is what makes it especially appealing to people. Hemalurgists can only spike themselves so many times before they start feeling negative mental and physical side effects. Hemalurgy will begin twisting and deforming the body over time, oftentimes leaving them in a state that's not even recognizably human, as we see with the Inquisitors in Era 1. Once charged, a hemalurgic spike must be inserted into the hemalurgist as soon as possible, or it will begin to decay, losing its power when outside of a body. This can be somewhat mitigated by covering the spike in blood. Effectively, the spike just has to think it's in a body to maintain its charge. Also, even when a spike reaches maximum decay, it still retains a small portion of the charge and never goes to zero. Due to the impact Hemalurgy has on one's soul, powerful writers and soothers have the ability to take control over the spiked person. At a low level of control, the spiked person will just hear whispers from the person trying to control them, but with enough power and spikes in the Hemalurgist's body, they can be taken over and forced to perform actions. Now that I've explained to you what Hemalurgy does broadly, it's time to explain what each individual metal steals. This is far more simple than the explanation for the allomantic or feruchemical metals, so we're going to do this lightning round style. First up, the physical metals. Iron spikes steal strength. Tin spikes steal senses. Steel spikes steal physical metal allomantic powers, and pewter spikes steal physical metal feruchemical powers. Cognitive metals. Zinc spikes steal emotional fortitude, basically increasing the will to keep on going even when under great amounts of stress. Copper spikes, on the other hand, steal mental fortitude, memory, and intelligence. Brass spikes steal cognitive metal feruchemical powers, while bronze steals mental metal feruchemical powers. Spiritual metals. Chromium spikes might steal destiny. Yes, that's the actual wording. A true potential metal. No, we don't know how it functions in practice and probably won't for a while. Aluminum spikes remove all magical powers. This would basically be used as a defensive hemalurgic spike, as all other spikes act as buffs to the sole person. Nitrocell spikes steal investiture, and duralumin spikes steal connection and identity. Last up for our 16 basic metals, we have the temporal metals. They are all straightforward, so let's get to wrapping this up. Cadmium spikes steal temporal metal allomantic powers. Electrum steals enhancement metal allomantic powers. Bendalloy spikes steal spiritual metal feruchemical powers, and gold steals hybrid metal feruchemical powers. That's it for the 16 basic metals. But just like the other two, we still got the god metals to cover. So far, we only know about what two of the god metals do when turned into hemalurgic spikes, those being adium and lerasium. Adium spikes have the ability to steal any ability, including other planets' magic systems, better than any other spikes. Lerasium, on the other hand, can steal all of the physical abilities, such as strength or speed, that one possesses. But why would you waste a metal that can literally turn you into an uber-powerful Mistborn just so you can, run faster? I assume we will see more uses for these god metals, and especially the more vague spiritual metals, as we progress through the future Mistborn eras. Well, that's it, folks. We took a long and detailed look at the three magic systems of Scadrial. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you liked it, or if you have some criticism, it's all good. Tell us down below, alongside what your favorite allomantic ability is. I also have to shout out the coppermine.net, who have been indispensable in helping me do the research for this video as I sifted through all of the obscure interviews with Brandon, where he elaborates on a lot of the niche metallic abilities. Thank you once again, don't forget to subscribe, and keep on reading. Duralumin users known as duralumin gnats, duralumin users known as duralumin mat. Oh my god. Duralumin users known as duralumin gnats. Duralumin users known as duralumin gnats have the ability to duralumin users known as duralumin gnats. Duralumin users known as duralumin mats. Why do I keep saying mats? Duralumin users known as duralumin gnats. Duralumin users known as duralumin gnats have the ability to enhance any other metals burned.